Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about pH, and in particular we're going to talk about the shift in pH and how extreme a 1-point shift in pH can be. Now when I talk about pH, I usually talk about it in terms of neutral-ish, or I talk about it in being terms of near neutral or sort of around neutral. And I throw that around a little cavalier, even though I also point out how a 1-point jump in pH is actually a lot more significant than a lot of people think, because it's a logarithmic scale. It's a multiple of 10 for every point you go. And so that does make the pH shift uneven. Not all 1-point shifts are created equal. So the closer we are to neutral, the less radical that shift is if you go 1 point up or down away from neutral. The further away you get from neutral, the more extreme that shift is. So when I'm talking about shifting between 7.6 and shifting it down to 7, that's not a lot of shift compared to, say, shifting it from 9 down to 8, or even 8.5 down to 7.5. That is a much larger shift than 8 down to 7. And the reason is because it's a logarithmic scale. Every point is 10 times more than the point below it. So if you go from 7 to 8, 8 is 10 times more alkaline than 7 is, but 9 is 10 times more alkaline than 8. So that would be 100 times more alkaline than 7. And I thought of a good way to visualize this, and we can visualize it simply by using salt. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take this, and we're going to say that is neutral. That is 1 gram of salt. So if we were to go either 1 point up or down, we would go to that, and that would be 10 grams of salt. So if this represents neutral at 7, this would represent 8. So again, that's a pretty significant amount of shift, but look at what happens when we shift from 8 to 9. Now look at how much that 10 times amount of shift is. So shifting from 9 to 8 is a lot more stuff going on in the tank. And then if we move up to a pH of 10, which I know is awfully high for a fish tank, but look at what we're dealing with now. It's a big sack of salt compared to the point below it. That would be 9, and that would be 10. So every time you go a point further away from neutral, that jump gets much, much more significant. So if we were going the other direction, and we were going to say that the salt represents the acidity, if that was neutral, this would be a pH of 6. Again, a pretty significant shift, but when you're shifting your fish from this to this, it's not a huge jump in the amount of acidity you've got in the tank. When you go down to 5, you've now jumped to this much, and it's a lot more acidic. And then of course, if you were to go all the way down to 4, you'd have that much acidity going on in the tank. So not all 1-point shifts are created equal. And when I talk about moving it around neutral or around 7, it's not that big of a deal to shift from 7 to 7.5. If you go from 8.5 to 9, that is a much more significant shift than 7 to 7.5 or 7 to 6.5. Now, the only exception I will make for that is when you cross that sort of basic acid barrier, that neutral point at 7. If you're shifting at 1 point, but that point is starting at 7.5, and you're shifting it down into the acidic range of 6.5, it's not much of a shift, but you're changing from basic conditions to acidic conditions. So you're actually completely changing the type of condition the fish is in. So that crossing over that 1 point of 7 can be a little more significant than that simple 1 point. But if we're talking about going in one direction or the other, if we start at 7 and move up to 8, it's just not that significant of a shift as it is to go from 8 to 9. So the higher your pH is, or the lower your pH is, the more change is going to happen when you start adjusting that pH. If your tank sits right around neutral, and you shift it a little bit, it's just not that big a deal. The further away you get, it's that logarithm, it's that power of 10. Every jump is 10 times the number below it. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about doing water changes and your pH is going to shift, or you're adding RO water, or you're adding aragonite coral or something to try to harden the water. Think about where your starting point is and how much you're shifting it, how quickly you're shifting it. And again, the further you get away from that neutral point, the more radical any shift that you're making is going to be. So that's my 2 cents for today. I just thought I'd throw that out there. I thought that was a good way of visualizing it for people. I hope that helped you understand it a little better. If you got any questions, comments, or anything, please leave them below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching this one. Make sure you're subscribed, and I'll see you real soon in the next one.